Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dorm Next Door podcast. I hope that you have all had a great week. I know I have. I am back here just literally for one episode, but something cool has happened that I wanted to tell the people that listen to this podcast about. So every listener, I wanted to let you know that I just recently went on a YouTube channel that you've probably heard of. It is called Jubilee. And I was on an episode called Jubilee Surrounded, titled Dr. Mike versus 20 RFK Jr. supporters. So there's going to be more on that. I'm allowed to talk about this now because the clip, by the time this episode is being released, the clip that is kind of previewing the episode has just been released on the Jubilee Instagram account, and I also think it's been released on short form on YouTube and other platforms. But super cool, and I'm going to talk about that maybe next week. I don't know. It's kind of one of those things where I know I did the thing, I worked hard, and I was very blessed through it. However, at the same time, I kind of like to just keep moving forward. You know, it kind of reminds me of Tim Tebow. He's not defined by what he's done in the past. I mean, obviously, it was a great opportunity. However, he wasn't necessarily defined by being the Florida Gators quarterback, or he wasn't defined by running this charity or that charity, or now being a college football commentator. He simply moves forward. But I might comment on it. I think it was great. However, I'm not just gonna focus on that, but there's stuff that I love to talk about. There's stuff that God puts on my heart every single week to share with the people who are interested in hearing. And so I think that's probably what I'm going to be doing instead. However, this week, as every week is, as I say, I know I say this every episode, this week has been crazy in the United States of America and beyond. So the focus of this episode is going to be kind of diversifying and switching up attention from what's going on in the United States, but also something that has happened in the UK that changes the course of their history, or at least what the status quo was for the last several centuries. And so we're starting this off. The Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey, who narrowly fended off Somali Omar Fateh, has just given a speech in the city of Minneapolis talking about the importance that Somali immigrants play in their economy. He talks about how without the immigrants, and I'm going to play a clip of the speech, but he talks about how the immigrants there are the group that welcomed him into Minneapolis and how they are vital for the economy, how they grow the city of Minneapolis, how they make the city of Minneapolis what it is. And I want you to watch this clip and hear this all for yourself. Take a look.
He's wrong, and we want them here. Somali people have been an extraordinary... He's wrong, and we want them here. Somali people have been an extraordinary benefit. I'll say it again. Somali people have been a benefit to our city for longer than I have been in our city. They have started businesses and created jobs. They have added to the cultural fabric of what Minneapolis is. They were welcoming to me when I first came out to Minneapolis. In fact, they were one of the first groups that I myself got to know. That's not American. That's not what we are about. And we're going to do right by every single person in our cities. And so, to our Somali community, Daman Shabka, Somaliyed Kunul, Minnesota, Garahan, Minneapolis, Waan, Ku Janilahai, Waan, Ku Gereb, Taganahan.
So as you can see, he says the city of Minneapolis has extraordinarily benefited from Somali immigrants, and that they were the group of people that welcomed him most. Now, keep in mind, this is after he fended off a Somali in the general election for the mayor of Minneapolis for his own re-election. And so what he did during this election was he and his opponent both pandered to that same demographic because they saw it as the group of voters that were going to sway for his favor or the other guy's favor so they could finally win, so that they could get reelected. So as a result, they pandered to a culture that is, in my opinion, one of the most foreign to American culture as it gets. Now, Somali culture, and you probably recognize the term Somalian outside of their country as the group of people who are most recognized as Somali pirates, that a lot of the time do things that the everyday American wouldn't even think of, and it's just in their culture. Now, he says that the city and the country beyond that benefits culturally from them and economically. But the truth about them is Somalians, as they rank, they are 172nd in the world as it relates to IQ. 172nd out of all of the countries in the world. The United States of America is around 27th place. So what happens when the average IQ of a Somali is 68 and they're moving and they're encouraged to move in large numbers from Somalia to the United States of America? What does that do to the national average IQ in our country? Well, it goes down. And this goes down when we import the third world in general. You cease to see American culture in the streets as people in Dearborn, Michigan, and people in Minneapolis are feeling the pressure. They're in many ways feeling threatened, bullied by these groups of people that are moving in large droves. Immigration in general is a major threat to the United States' sovereignty, to its existence, as immigration was a threat to the rest of the West, Europe specifically, and as it also aided in the collapse of Rome. So, to answer to the economic part, right? So he believes that Somalians are vital to the economy of Minneapolis. But I saw a statistic in it is that 42.8% of Somalis are on food stamps. 42.8%. That's almost half. That's almost half. And you are literally a detriment to the economy. Not you as a person, but the act of being on food stamps is a detriment to the economy, let alone 42% of this people group. And we have a large percentage of Americans in our country, and that are on food stamps, that were born here. And I think that is something that should take our focus. I think that's something that should take priority. But there's now this pattern in the United States of America with politicians all across the country that are pandering to whether it's Mexicans, Iraqis, Somalians, and the big one is Israel. And you see politicians pandering for these people's votes. They want to appeal to these people. They want to appeal to them culturally by participating in some of the traditions that they have, or speaking to their concerns, speaking out about how great it is that they're moving to our country in droves in an effort to get their vote. And this happens on both sides. They want the votes of these people, these demographics. They want to reach out to them. But through that, the American demographic has been completely forgotten about. There's far less speaking out about American culture, preserving American sovereignty. In fact, talking about American sovereignty gets you called a white nationalist, gets you called a white supremacist, gets you called a Nazi. And speaking out against the dominance of Israel in American foreign policy and politics in general in our country gets you called an anti-Semite. And I remember, if you've seen the last week, one of the 10 nominees, and I think a good amount of the 10 nominees for Anti-Semite of the Year are people that simply speak out against the war. They're simply people that speak up for the people in Gaza. One specific children's entertainer, Miss Rachel, is literally somebody that advocates for peace. So the criteria in our country to be called a racist, if you oppose the status quo, if you oppose the people and what they're doing, the people in power and what they're doing, the criteria is very, very low to be called a name, to be called an anti-Semite, to be called a racist. For just asking a question, well, what about Americans? Well, what about our country? What about the people that live here? What about the people that are born here that are dying on the streets? What about the veterans who served in the wars for foreign interest that don't even get to reap any benefit for their service? Their suicide rate is very high. They experience poverty at rates that are unprecedented, and large amounts of them are homeless. I mean, I've seen many, many Vietnam War vets that are homeless. We're talking a war that was now 60 years ago. And the people have such poor benefits in the VA that they're living on the streets, and there's no sign that it's going to get better. Pete Hegseth talked about this when he was the nominee, when he was the presumptive nominee to be the Secretary of Defense. But are things getting better? That's a good question to ask. I don't necessarily know if there is an answer to that as of this moment. But all across the country, the politicians don't want your vote. They don't care about your vote. They take your vote for granted. They don't really care about you. They just assume that they're going to get it. They assume that we're stupid enough to simply vote within our party lines. They'll throw us a bone every once in a while and speak to some issues that we'll get excited about. But other than that, for the most part, they're talking about the problems that the people from Israel have. They're talking about, well, Jews are experiencing anti-Semitism at rates like never before. They're talking about Islamophobia. They're talking about racism to every single people group instead of focusing on the main issue, which is the decline of the United States. It's the decline of the people that live within our own country. Every country rots within. The decline of great empires in history have always been marked by a decline from the inside out. Most of these great empires weren't simply conquered and wiped out by a bigger power. And in fact, we are the biggest power in the world right now. Rome was the biggest power in the world at its time, and it rotted from the inside out. It collapsed from the inside out. It ripped in two first, between two ideologies. It ripped completely in half. It was too big to manage. It wouldn't have been too big to manage had its people been united under the same idea. But then it became confusing as to recognizing what a Roman actually was. This is the same issue. History does not necessarily repeat itself. However, its ability to rhyme is extraordinary. And we're seeing all these signs today. We're seeing our politicians as they sell themselves out to enter into office. Before entering office, we used to be in a country where the politician would promise change and they would be exciting, they'd be authentic, they'd have a grassroots movement behind them. And then once they got into office, that's when the special interests hit. And that's when their message got affected. That's when a lot of times they had to sell out to even survive in Washington, D.C. We saw this with Trump. In 2016, his message was different than it is today. Because naturally, by default, by system, the people who wanted to get their foot into, to own the politician, to own the presidency, got their money through, and then they finally got their say. They surrounded him in his cabinet, and they opposed us. And then we see change over time. It used to be that way. It used to be all the bad things happened after you got into office. You got changed by the power. Now, we're seeing these people are changing themselves when they decide that they want to run for office. So to get power, they're behaving the way that they know that they have to. Before, they're not saying to Americans, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. They might on the surface. They might when they're in public, or they might when they're doing a rally. But really, they're figuring out how they can get endorsed by AIPAC. Because that is how you get into office. The crazy thing about AIPAC is the fact that in all these congressional races, right, 99% of their candidates go on to win the general election. 99% of the candidates that are supported by AIPAC. They desire to keep their hold on Congress so badly that what they're willing to do is they're willing to outspend literally everybody. In the 2024 election cycle, George Latimer, I don't even know if I pronounced his last name correctly, but he was given $15 million for his congressional race in New York to oust a congressman prior to him that had taken $0 from the Israel lobby. $0. So you know what they're going to do? AIPAC, wants to have control over our country so bad, they want to maintain it. I shouldn't even say they want to have it. They want to maintain their control over the United States so bad in Congress and the Senate, in the executive branch, probably even the courts. They want to maintain this so badly that they will simply outspend you. They will outspend the average American that donates maybe $50, $100, maybe less than that, to the candidate that they think represents them. This is where we are. It literally does not matter anymore if you and your family, if you and your community love a candidate. These people have more money than you. They're willing to use it. A congressman. There are over 400 members of Congress. There are 435 seats. And they're willing to pour $15 million into one candidate to make sure that he gets elected. And outside of that, they're also going to manipulate the media to attack your favorite candidate in our country. They're going to support the narrative of a country that's thousands of miles away before they'll ever hear you out, before they'll ever hear your voice. Because as of this point in our country, your opinion does not matter to them. It probably hasn't for a long while, but now it's so in our faces that these issues are talked about every single day. Israel's talked about every single day. The Middle East is talked about every single day. And it takes priority over all of the issues in our own country. For the most part. I can't say this in its entirety because Trump did just release on X his greatest statement over the last 5 years plus, where he basically acknowledged what we've all been saying for the last election campaign when we put him in office for the second time, where we're saying we need these people out of our country. And he finally answered. He finally stopped immigration from third world countries. Right? That's one of those moments where it's like, yes, that's our needs being put first. But outside of that, we get crickets. We hear nothing. Another piece of legislation that has just been proposed by Senator Randy Fine is he wants, and I'm going to read this. This is Randy Fine. He has just introduced a bill that would force the State Department to give briefings on rising anti-Semitism in Europe. Now, these briefings would be given to both the House and Senate committees on foreign affairs. At the same time, he blames Europe for the rise of anti-Semitism and threatens all of Europe, saying that their society is going to collapse because of it. Watch this clip.
This bill directs the State Department to address that growing threat of anti-Semitism, to make clear to our European allies that the conduct that they have allowed to take place within their countries is simply unacceptable. After this assessment, the Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs will engage with those countries that are identified as countries of apparent concern and ask for their cooperation in countering this rising anti-Semitism, and it will require those individuals to provide a briefing to both our committee and our Senate counterpart to make sure we are up to date on what these European countries are doing. But make no mistake, and let me say this loudly and clearly, what these European countries have allowed to take place in their countries is unacceptable. And we should be warned that where anti-Semitism rears its ugly head, societal collapse soon comes thereafter. That's what we've seen in 3,000 years of anti-Semitism around the world. So I again want to thank the chairman for bringing this bill up, for making it a priority, for allowing us to say to our friends in Europe that what they have allowed is simply unacceptable and that we in the United States will be watching. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Now tell me right now, what does that issue, what does that have to do with us? Nothing. And your tax dollars are going to be spent on the cause. Intelligence costs money. None of us wanted this. Nobody wants this at this point in our country. Everybody's literally completely sick of it. But you don't have a choice. You don't have a say. And in fact, you just asking about it will probably put you in the same category that he's talking about. He'll call you an anti-Semite. He'll say that you need to be spied on. He'll say that you need to be on a list for questioning anything that he does or questioning the cause. He'll say that you're the problem. You, the person that could have voted him into office to represent you. The community that he voted, that voted for him. That same community could fall victim to this as well. Consent of the governed, my friends. We give them consent to govern us. So the moment that they do not represent us is the moment that they need to answer to us. Do not forget that. Whether it's Trump, whoever else. And Trump has proven to be a great listener. I will say that. In the last election cycle, he changed a lot during his campaign. And things get different when you're in office. However, these people answer to us. As far as I'm concerned, the way that our Constitution was written means that we elect the senators every 6 years, and every single election cycle, we get to decide who's in the House. So that guy, remind him the next time he tries to push a legislation that is against our will, the next time he gets to push a piece of legislation that is something that you would only see, that should only exist in the Israeli parliament or Europe if they're making the decision about themselves, the next time he tries to do that, remind him, hey, we voted for you. We put you in office, and we can vote you out. It's our right. In fact, it's the right thing for us to do. And I would say to whoever's listening to this, if there's one person that's in his district, you have a duty, because he is guilty of espionage, to vote him out of office. He shouldn't be there. He should be running for the parliament in Israel, probably. Most likely. Wherever your loyalty lies is where you should represent. So if your loyalty is with another country, with a different cause, then you have no place in our politics. And I think if you asked the everyday person on the street, just say, hey, what do you think about this? They would have the exact same answer that I have. If you don't want to represent Americans and meet them where they are, then you do not deserve to be in American politics. And to say that it's a radical thing nowadays. But this wasn't a problem 80 years ago. We didn't have this invasive Israel lobby that had the final say in our politics, that now has most of the say in our politics. It just wasn't a thing. And Americans today, if they saw us degrade ourselves to that point, would be severely disappointed in our generations. And it's taken several generations to get here. So we've allowed it to the point where now it's in our face. And it's a lot harder to make the change. It's a lot harder to do anything about it when it reaches the point where it's taken over completely, where foreign money has taken over our country completely. An America that's built up of a bunch of different countries and their interests is not America. A country cannot live like that. And if somebody says that, oh, America is meant to be culturally diverse, if they're saying that diversity is our strength, they're completely wrong. Because diversity is also diversity in priority. It's diversity in ideology. It's diversity in morals. All these things make up diversity. And when you have that kind of a diversity, then eventually you can't recognize a country as one unit. Unity is our strength. We are going to reach a point where as a country we cease to have a national identity. And I don't even think, to some extent, we don't even have a national identity today. To some extent, Americans will look at the sky and they can't agree that it's blue. And what I mean by that is 100 years ago, all Americans for the most part were on the same page. Landslides took place in a lot of elections because Americans all kind of agreed, okay, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need this change, we need this candidate, he supports us. Candidates used to win by a lot bigger margins. Then in the last 40 years, there have been some major victories. However, elections have gotten really, really close. And that's not to say there weren't close elections in the past, but what I'm speaking to is the fact that our country is so divided on ideology, on culture. We're so divided on truth that 50-50, a house divided cannot stand. And these are the words of Jesus Christ, reiterated by Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. We will become like Europe, where you watch your rights get voted away, get decided away by the representatives you put in. And in Europe, just recently, they have now proposed a bill that would completely erase trial by jury cases for less serious offenses. This would be erasing an 800-year right since the Magna Carta in 1215, where you got to have a trial by jury. You had due process. It was a given right to the citizens in that country, and it's something that they have had since then. They would be erasing what is now considered to be an ancient right because they now have so many cases. They have 75,000 backlogged cases. And many of these offenses, I would have to say, are most likely for things that we would probably be absolutely just disgusted that are even illegal. These are probably for offenses that shouldn't even be offenses. And I'll tell you what, the United States is always next. Agencies within the government have been given a lot of these powers and loopholes so that they can get rid of jury. They can be judge, jury, and executioner themselves. So what happens when the Seventh Amendment doesn't mean anything anymore? What happens when you yourself do not get a jury? A jury is supposed to be a ruling by your peers, the people that are alike to you, the people in your community. What happens when the people in your community no longer get their side of the story, no longer get their say in what happens to you? And the ruling in the court is by a judge that you might not know, that might want you to be put behind bars. So what happens when your peers no longer get a say? What happens when your friends? I would consider my everyday American to be a friend. And I mean an everyday American. I mean somebody that's born here, has lived here, has grown up in the United States of America, and loves our country. They're a friend. We got to look at them as a friend. But what happens when you no longer have those people to look out for you? Because it is a form of support for the accused in court. Is that you got your people. You got people that were like you. You got people that had the same life experiences as you. You got Americans as well to look at your situation, and they got to have a say. Not just some judge that removes all emotion from whatever happens to you. Not a judge that could care less a lot of the time. Not a judge that was paid for by George Soros to have the position that they have. A lot of state attorney generals, a lot of state lawyers, a lot of state judges, in many cases, are now going to be paid for on a large scale by the rich. George Soros owns a lot of district attorneys. He owns a lot of them. So what happens when we live in America where that person decides whether you're a free man or you're behind bars, and your peers, the everyday American, has no say? It's a scary reality. That could be the truth in our country. Because when we watch Europe fall, when we watch the UK fall, a lot of time we are next. We can be next. But I think that as far as our country goes, we have the ability and the spirit to fight that no other country seems to pay any mind to. So just hold that in your heart. The fact that you listen to a podcast, the fact that you are deviating your digestion of media from wanting to watch mainstream media and everyday news, whatever is given to you, and that you want to research, you want to think for yourself, just that step is enough to begin the journey to freedom again in our country. Because if we all were that way, if we all wanted to think for ourselves, if we all turned off the news that's given to us at 5 p.m. every evening, and we researched and we got to the bottom of the questions that we had, if we got to the bottom of the issues in front of us, we would be a lot more unified than we actually thought. So thank you all for listening to episode 10. I got 10 episodes. That's more than 9. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I'll see you all next week. God bless you for listening to this. Share this with a friend. If you don't have any friends, but I think you do, share this with a family member. If you're not around anybody, go on the corner of a street with a cardboard sign like I have sometimes and say, hey, listen to episode 10 of the Dorm Next Door podcast, available on all platforms. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all next week. Goodbye.